Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas's wife, Virginia Thomas, has now become the latest right-wing figure to be targeted in the ongoing congressional investigation into the January 6, 2021 incursion on Capitol Hill. As it has been revealed, she sent text messages to former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows in the days leading up to the incident. On Thursday, one day before Supreme Court announced that Justice Thomas had been released from the hospital following a week-long stay after being admitted for an infection last week, the media breathlessly reported that Mrs. Thomas had sent the texts to Meadows, which echoed a statement and sentiment that was commonplace among Trump supporters in the pre-January 6th aftermath of the 2020 election. According to text messages obtained and reviewed by the Washington Post, Thomas urged for support for the great president and wrote on November 10th, "The left is attempting the greatest heist of our history." In a later text, Meadows assured Mrs. Thomas that good would prevail. He wrote on November 24th, as the Trump camp was making its case for campaign fraud, "This is a fight of good versus evil. Evil always looks like the victor until the King of Kings triumphs. Do not grow weary in well-doing. The fight continues." Thomas thanked him in response and wrote, "This plus a conversation with my best friend just now. I will try to keep holding on. America is worth it." It's not clear who her best friend is, but some have speculated that she was referring to her husband, Justice Thomas, with whom she is apparently not allowed to discuss personal views on current events in private because he is a sitting Supreme Court justice. Mrs. Thomas, a conservative activist in her own right, has faced increasing scrutiny over her alleged involvement in organizing the January 6th Stop the Steal rally, which was vocally intended to be entirely peaceful, but of course will always be remembered for the breach into the Capitol building, despite the overwhelmingly law-abiding protesters who remained non-violent and broke no laws. Thomas has denied ever being involved with organizing the rally, and as she told the Washington Free Beacon earlier this month, the text messages were turned over to the January 6th committee by Meadows, who has been in their crosshairs for some time. They bolster claims that Ginny Thomas was egging the Trump camp on in its refusal to concede. In one, she urged Meadows not to concede and also shared links to theories about how the election might have been stolen and pointed him to various right-wing pundits such as Rush Limbaugh and Dan Bongino, who were presumably presenting their own theories. One closely scrutinized messages involved a reference to the now notorious attorney Sidney Powell, from whom the Trump legal camp would later distance itself over her bold claims of widespread election fraud. Thomas reportedly wrote to Meadows at one point, "Sounds like Sidney and her team are getting inundated with evidence of fraud. Make a plan, release the Kraken and save us from the left taking America down." Speaking to the Free Beacon, Thomas was clear that she, like millions of Americans, no doubt was disappointed with both the outcome of the election and the violence that broke out on January 6th. Yet, she was firm that she played no hand in organizing the rally, as had been claimed in reports by the New Yorker and New York Magazine. She stated in the negative as she spoke to Beacon about, and I quote, "stories in the press suggesting I paid or arranged for buses, and stories saying I mediated feuding factions of leaders for that day." As the Post notes, her text messages certainly do give new insights into the degree to which she was offering counsel to the Trump White House, as her husband would subsequently be presented with the campaign's legal challenges to the election. They will also play a role in calls for Justice Thomas to recuse himself should the High Court consider further cases involving claims of election fraud in 2020, although, as Mrs. Thomas told the Beacon, She claims she and her husband have entirely separate professional lives. Opponents of Trump and those who promote the narrative of a Trump-led insurrection campaign that sought to overthrow an entirely legitimate and fraud-free election are no doubt thrilled to have a reason to link it to Justice Thomas, who dissented from his colleagues' decision not to hear the cases which challenged the outcome of the 2020 election. One wonders, however, if there would have been the same degree of scrutiny into how, say, Justices Sonia Sotomayor or Stephen Breyer's spouses might have communicated with affiliates privately in the aftermath of the 2016 election, which, let's not forget, the political media establishment spent a great deal of energy undermining for several years while Trump was in office. Conservatives would have been outraged for sure. But would the Post, one of the top sellers of the Trump-Russia conspiracy theory? Powell's far-reaching wild theories about election fraud might not be bought by many, but it's far from hysterical to state that there was at least some funny business. After all, there have been aspects of alleged election fraud that have been proven to be legitimate, or rather, illegitimate. The Congressional Democrats and the anti-Trump Republicans, as well as the mainstream media complex, would no doubt have you forget that before the incursion of Capitol Hill, the movement to challenge the results of the election was entirely peaceful and civil, and it took place within the confines of our constitutional system, that is, in state legislatures, the courts, and the halls of Congress. There is a good chance that had the protesters never stormed the Capitol building that day, the bid to overturn the results of the election would have failed, but it would have failed after going through the proper and appropriate channels, and operatives like Meadows and Mrs. Thomas would have simply chosen how to respond politically and legally. Instead, the establishment is desperately trying to paint them as the treasonous masterminds behind a banana republic-style insurrection, which many would argue is, at the very least, no better than what the Clinton campaign and the Obama administration have long been quite reliably accused of doing in 2016. One would hope, at the very least, that all parties could be considered with the same degree of scrutiny, since absolutely no one is or should be above the law. Unfortunately, it hardly seems possible anymore, particularly when it comes to the agenda of Washington, D.C.'s elite and the reporters who, rather than fairly expose any and all wrongdoing as best they can without bias, play a very active role in the broader agenda. We'd like to know your thoughts and responses. Share them in the comments down below, and also share this news and support us through subscribing to our channel. Thanks for watching.